Here we go. Good morning.
Morning.
Okay. Well, we'll let you get away with that because it's a small crowd. So my name's Enrique Gonzalez. I work for a law firm called Fragomen Worldwide. We're the oldest and largest immigration law firm in the world. But more important than that, we're UCF's Immigration Council. We also counsel most of the state universities in Florida. So today, the purpose of my being here is to be able to provide information to the international students who may be affected by the entry ban that was brought forth in the executive order announced by the Trump administration almost 2 weeks ago now. In fact, I think it is exactly 2 weeks to the day. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that this session's informative because there are significant changes. I had put together a presentation, and then last night around 8 o'clock we had to change it because of a court order that sustained a temporary restraining order against the Trump administration executive order. We'll get to that in a moment. We'll also talk about the lay of the land, but I also want to make sure that the students who are here, that you feel free anywhere along the way, stop and ask questions, okay? So does anybody have any questions? Good, because if you did, I'd be in trouble. I haven't said anything yet. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's talk about what happened. So that everybody understands exactly that we're talking off the same point of reference. Executive order, we refer to it as an entry ban, not a travel ban. And the reason for that is there's a difference in the meaning between entry. Entry is you're not allowed to enter. Travel means you can't travel. Well, you can continue to travel throughout the United States under this executive order. I'll get into the substance of the executive order in a few minutes. And then we'll talk about what happened in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals last night out in San Francisco. We'll also talk about what we still have to expect as a result of this case. More importantly, we'll talk about some practical guidance. Now, what's important here is that I am taking no position one way or the other in support or against the administration's position on this issue. I'm here only to provide practical guidance on what we think is what you should and should not be doing if you're affected by this executive order. Emphasis on this is that we are here to share information with you. So if you want to have a discourse about whether it's something that's good or bad, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it afterwards. But the purpose is just to give you information about it. Is practical information. You may not agree with some of the practical information we give you, but the purpose is to be able to help you and protect you if you're affected or may be affected in the future by this executive order. Okay? So let's start first by talking about what did the executive order cover. The executive order covered 7 different nationalities from Muslim majority countries. Those 7 nationalities, I think everyone already knows which ones they are, such as Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, and a few others, Libya, Syria. Okay? As of last night, the executive order prohibiting individuals from entering the United States who were from one of these 7 countries. As of last night, the executive order is still on hold. There is something what we call a temporary restraining order that says, a temporary injunction that says it cannot go into effect. Now, let's go back in the history a little bit of 2 weeks. Executive order is issued on January 27th by the Trump administration, which would prohibit individuals from these 7 countries to enter the United States until April 27th of this year. So it was a 90-day ban on entry into the United States. The executive order also went further and refused to admit individuals who were refugees for the next 90 days and indefinitely for refugees from Syria. All these different provisions of the executive order were put on hold Saturday of last week. Why? A federal court judge in Seattle ruled or issued a temporary injunction because there was more likelihood than not that it would adversely impact citizens of the state of Washington, the families of the people in the state of Washington, universities and professors and students in the state of Washington. Shortly thereafter, the state of Minnesota joined the lawsuit. So this judge put this ban, this hold on the entry ban on a temporary basis. The Trump administration proceeded immediately to appeal that decision from that judge. Now, this doesn't mean that this executive order could never go into effect. The temporary injunction just says it can't go into effect right now. So the Trump administration appeals to what's called the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I'll give you a lesson, civics lesson, immigration / judicial system 101 in a moment to explain how this works. but it went up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they heard it twice. The first time was one judge continued the order of the judge from the federal court in Seattle. It then was appealed again to a 3-judge panel. That 3-judge panel is the panel that ruled last night unanimously to maintain the injunction in place. That means keep the hold on the executive order from taking effect. Now, we'll talk about what happens after this, but for right now, at least as of today, the executive order cannot take effect, and persons from these 7 countries can continue to travel into the United States, whether they be U.S. citizens, whether they be permanent residents, whether they be persons on student visas or exchange visitor visas. These individuals can continue to travel into the United States for the time being. Okay? We'll talk about the different groups that were affected by this in a little bit. Let's just talk about how the judicial system works for a moment. So, U.S. courts are divided both at the federal level and at the state level. Federal level has applicability to federal law, cross-applicability to the entire country. A federal court in a certain district in the state of Washington, Seattle, with a judge appointed by the Bush administration, so a Republican-appointed judge, held a hearing, an emergency hearing a little over a week ago, where he issued this injunction. So that's the federal district court level. What happens after that? Things get appealed to a circuit court. And our country is divided into circuits. And the state of Washington falls into what is called the Ninth Circuit. And what happens after that? If you don't like the decision from that court, you appeal it up to the Supreme Court. Now, appeals up to the Supreme Court do not have to be heard by the Supreme Court. They can pick and choose which cases they will take. Federal court at the district level and at the circuit court level don't have a choice. They have to hear every case that comes before them. So where are we today? Last night, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel, voted unanimously to keep this on hold. What ends up happening after this? Well, the Trump administration can request to appeal it to the full panel of the entire Circuit Court of Appeals. Or they could try to take it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the likelihood of their succeeding with a full panel at the Circuit Court, not very good. 2 of the judges were Democrats, 1 was Republican appointed last night on that 3-0. So you have 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, total of 4 judges over the course of the last week and a half who have found that the executive order potentially violates constitutional law. So what could happen? It could go up to the Supreme Court. As you all may know, we only have 8 justices right now because we just recently nominated the 9th justice. Out of those 8 justices, 4 were appointed by Democrats and 4 were appointed by Republicans. As we saw with an immigration case last year from the Obama administration, the Obama administration appealed a decision from a Texas court which was unfavorable to the immigrant community. And it went to the Supreme Court, but it reached a 4-4 tie. What happens with a 4-4 tie? You don't win, you lose. Because the prior decision from the underlying court is what stands as the law today. So that's where we are with this executive order at this time, is that it's not in place. It can't take effect. How long will this happen? Well, we don't know, because we don't know what's going to be the next step for the administration until they announce it. What we do know is that the president last night announced in capital letters, "See you in court." Okay? So we do expect that the president and the administration will probably end up appealing either to the full panel of the Ninth Circuit or to the Supreme Court. So enough boring details, right? Okay, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Again, 7 countries that are affected by the entry ban into the United States. This does not mean that the individuals cannot travel freely throughout the United States while they're here. Okay? It's important, that's why we emphasize entry ban as opposed to travel ban. The other thing is, who is not subject? We already know that the administration has declared on several occasions over the course of the last 2 weeks that they've carved out some exceptions to make sure that there's no misunderstanding as to who's covered and who's not covered. Who's not covered? A U.S. citizen who may have been born in one of these 7 countries. We know that they're U.S. citizens. They have a U.S. passport. And if they're entering the United States, they can only enter with one document, a U.S. passport. So they won't be using the passport from one of those 7 countries if they still have a passport from one of those 7 countries. So we know that those persons, U.S. citizens, born in one of these countries or who is a dual national of the United States and one of these 7 countries, can travel into the United States. We'll give you a word of caution on this group as well as all others in a moment. Who else Let's say you're from the United Kingdom. You have a UK passport, but you also have a passport from Iran, okay? And you have a student visa. Well, the student visa, if it's in the UK passport, this ban doesn't apply to them either. They'll be able to apply for entry into the United States when they arrive via land, air, or sea, okay? So we know it doesn't apply to them either. The administration has announced this much. As long as you're traveling on the passport of the other country, not one of the 7 countries. Permanent residence. Now, when you become a lawful permanent resident of the United States, and most people refer to this as the green card, okay, you're still a citizen of one of these other countries, of some other country. So if you're a citizen of one of these 7 countries, but a permanent resident of the United States, you can still enter the United States. This was the one that probably caused the greatest concern. All categories caused a lot of concern. But this was the one that we felt was probably the most egregious in light of the fact that you're a permanent resident of the United States. We've admitted you to the United States. We've vetted you already. Okay? So these are the 3 groups that we know that the executive order, even if it were to take effect again, even if a full panel of the Ninth Circuit says, well, you know what, we're going to discontinue this temporary stay, we're going to let it take effect, we know that these 3 groups it won't impact. Okay? So, dual nationals, non-immigrants, and permanent residents and non-immigrants, what to expect. What can we tell you? Okay? What words of advice, sage words of wisdom, okay? Doing this for 25 years, but better than that, I'm the father of 3 teenage daughters, and you can't take more hits than that, right? Okay, laugh, guys, laugh, okay? It's good for the video, okay? Now, so, my advice to you after doing this for 25 years and serving as counsel in the U.S. Senate to a U.S. Senator would be the following, okay? If you're a U.S. citizen born in one of these countries, or if you're a permanent resident of the United States born in one of these countries, or if you're a dual national born in one of these countries or have a passport from one of these countries and a visa to the U.S., continue to travel. Business as usual. Okay? Because we know that regardless of what happens with the executive order, unless they come out with a radically different executive order, that you're going to be able to travel without any concern. Now, right now, theoretically and practically speaking, as of right now, anyone who's here from one of these countries on a student visa or an exchange visitor visa can also travel. That's the theory. That's why the court said we're not going to impose the ban on entry into the United States. So you can leave. What's the problem? We don't know how this is going to play out yet. There's still the possibility of an appeal to the Ninth Circuit full panel. There's an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we don't know how they're going to rule. And if you travel and they come down with a decision, look how fast this has all transpired in the course of 2 weeks. Usually court cases take months, if not years, but these are handled on an expedited basis. We don't know what's going to happen while you're outside the United States. So my practical advice is you can legally travel. Number 1. Should you really do it? Number 2, though. And you really need to consider not traveling because you just don't know how this is going to play out. Now, the executive order was intended only for 90 days. So theoretically, if we get past April 27th, this is what we call in legal terms a moot issue. The point may be moot. But in the meantime, you want to exercise caution. Now, as I said previously, I'm not here to make a political statement one way or the other for or against anyone. Okay? Everyone deserves to be treated equally, and that's the bottom line. But there's a time and a place for everything. So, I understand that there's a lot of passion and anger and emotion involved with this issue, and rightfully so. However, there's a time and a place for everything. We are a country of free speech, but there's a time and a place for everything. What's the best example I can tell you right now? Would it be appropriate for somebody to walk in this room right now and scream fire if there's no fire? Right? There's a time and a place for everything. That's not, if there was a fire, we want them to scream fire. But if there's no fire, don't scream fire. What do I mean by this? If you're one of the persons who's affected by this situation and you're seeking entry into the United States, the last thing you want to do is get in an argument with the Customs and Border Protection officer who's inspecting you. Okay? So we urge you, we encourage you to cooperate with the questions that you're asked and to answer them truthfully. It will facilitate your entry into the United States. Your voice will resonate a lot louder from inside the United States than from inside a Customs and Border Protection cell where no one can hear you. Okay? Yes, there are advocates there to defend you, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, who did an incredible job by getting the first executive order injunction at the start up in New York, okay? But until they get there, you're going to be muzzled. So there's a time and a place to talk, cooperate. If not, you're going to draw more suspicion to yourself. Make sure that your documents are in order. Make sure your passport is valid. Make sure your I-20 or DS-2019 has been properly endorsed and that it's still valid. Okay? These are practical pieces of advice. If you want to go ahead and make it a demonstration inside of Customs and Border Protection while you're coming into the United States, then go ahead. It's your choice. We're here to help you get into the United States to pursue your studies at UCF. Okay? What you do after that, from a political perspective, is up to each and every one of you. Okay? So, practical advice is make sure if you have to apply for a renewal of your visa and you decide to travel outside the United States, practical advice is going to tell you no one's going to be able to guarantee when that visa is going to be issued by the U.S. Embassy abroad. So you need to think twice before you leave the country. Because if you don't have a valid visa to return, that means you're going to have to go get a new visa stamp because the old one may have expired. So you want to think, how long is it going to take for you to get that visa stamp? Theoretically speaking, it's been publicly announced that the embassies and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services have no holds placed on the processing of applications. That does not mean that those applications are not going to be subject to the new extreme vetting procedures that are being implemented. Well, if there is new additional vetting that has to be undertaken, that means that there's probably going to take longer to process your application. And that who knows what will happen with these federal court cases. So let's go back to that court case out of Seattle. The court case in Seattle was someone brought a lawsuit saying that they're citizens of their state, so the Attorney General of Washington, in fact, brought a lawsuit saying that the citizens of that state would be adversely impacted by this executive order and that it was against the Constitution. It was a violation of constitutional rights. A judge said, okay, well, while we hear your arguments to see if it's true or not, I'm issuing an injunction saying that this order cannot take effect. There's still a case that has to be fought out in the federal court in Seattle. Okay? So at the end of the day, the federal government may prevail on that case. And if you travel and the case decision comes down, you may get stuck outside the United States. So we urge you to exercise caution when you're traveling. Visa waiver program, I'm not going to talk too much about this. There's a number of slides here. This will be posted on the UCF Global website.